Toronto didn't just happen. It was built, deliberately, by dynasties operating in the shadows that most people never paid attention to. Forget the skyscrapers and the banking districts for a second. The real story is about the outsiders who showed up with empty pockets and a refusal to stay invisible. This isn't a bedtime story. It is a playbook on power. And at the center of it is how one wealthy family after another figured out how to turn being locked out into total domination. Turn the clock back to the early 1900s. The local establishment had Toronto in a chokehold. It was a closed club. If you were a Jewish immigrant escaping Europe, the doors to the banks and elite circles were slammed in your face. But they didn't waste time trying to break in. They built a parallel economy right next door. Mom-and-pop shops turned into supply networks. Junkyards transformed into factories. A single wealthy family would start with a pushcart and end up owning the dirt under the city's future skyline. These families figured out the secret. True power whispers. It's structural. You control the raw materials, the real estate, and the workforce, and the influence comes to you. Storefronts morphed into manufacturing hubs. Manufacturing evolved into wholesale empires. Before anyone realized the game had changed, another wealthy family was quietly running the neighborhoods and the cash flow. That is the real origin story of this town. No splashy headlines, just playing the long game. It wasn't about privilege, it was pure strategy. Every brick they laid became a stepping stone for the next generation. This metropolis is running on an operating system coded decades ago by these guys. In this series, we are peeling back the layers on the hidden dynasties that took Toronto from a sleepy immigrant stopover to a global titan, one calculated move at a time. Quick check-in. Where are you tuning in from? If you are stateside in the US, drop a 1 in the comments. Representing Canada, drop a 2. Anywhere else on the map, give me a 3. And if you love deep dives into power, legacy, and how the elite operate, hit that subscribe button and stick around. Long before the banking towers cast shadows or the world paid attention, the real money was being made right on the pavement. Narrow alleys, jammed row houses. The ground floor was buzzing with trade. The transformation started in the trenches, the immigrant blocks, where being creative was the only way to eat. Kensington Market is the perfect example. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the launchpad for more than one wealthy family way before the money was visible. Early 1900s, waves of Jewish refugees are flooding in, running from poverty and violence in Eastern Europe. They arrived in a city that gave them a job but zero respect. Frozen out of the big leagues, they did what underdogs do best. They created their own league. Families turned their living rooms into businesses overnight. You sleep upstairs, you hustle downstairs. This sidewalk was the showroom. This wasn't entrepreneurship for the glory. It was survival with a plan. What started as food stalls and pushcarts evolved fast. You had butchers, tailors, bakers, and grocers all trading on trust. The cash didn't leave the block. It just kept circulating and reinvesting. A single wealthy family often pulled ahead, not by starting rich, but by scaling smarter, buying the building next door, supplying the other shops, financing the new guys. Kensington was a pressure cooker where ambition compounded every single day. By the 1920s, this district wasn't just a market, it was an engine. The profits from these small businesses built synagogues, schools, and eventually manufacturing plants down the road. This is where retail graduated to industry. This is where a wealthy family learned the golden rule: don't just sell the product, control the supply. Together, they redrew the financial map of the city. Individually, each wealthy family proved that rejection could be turned into leverage. They didn't beg for a seat at the table. They created a necessity. And once the city realized it couldn't function without them, the influence followed naturally. That was chapter 1 of real power, built quietly, block by block, way before Toronto realized who was actually pouring the foundation. As the city sprawled, nobody cared about luxury. They needed the basics: nails, steel, bolts, wire. Every home and warehouse depended on that hardware. While the fancy bankers were chasing clout, a different group of families understood the harsh truth. If you own the supply, you own the growth. This is where the immigrant hustle graduated to industrial domination, and where the first truly powerful wealthy families started stepping out from behind the curtain. The wholesale game changed the math. Unlike retail, it scaled fast and required big vision. These families were bringing in scrap metal, processing it, and selling it right back to a city that was tearing itself down and rebuilding at record speed. One man's trash was literally their inventory. Construction booms meant constant demand, and demand meant leverage. Suddenly, one wealthy family wasn't just watching the expansion, they were fueling it. We are talking massive warehouses and factories now, not corner stores. The contracts got huge, the margins got tight, and the stakes went through the roof. This transition took discipline, trust, and relentless reinvestment. Success wasn't about daily cash in the register anymore. It was about locking down the supply chain for the long haul. A wealthy family that mastered wholesale became untouchable. Builders needed them. Manufacturers relied on them. The city itself quietly leaned on their operations. But here is the kicker. They had the money, but still couldn't get into the social clubs. The barriers were still up. Their response was strategic, not emotional. They invested in permanence land, infrastructure, institutions. They built libraries, funded hospitals, endowed universities. They didn't do it for a round of applause. They did it for legitimacy. Money buys influence, but giving back buys respect. The script flipped. They weren't the scrappy outsiders anymore. Each wealthy family became a pillar holding the roof up. Their factories drove the economy. Their philanthropy smoothed over the social friction, and their patience changed the rules of the game. By the time the skyscrapers went up and the banks expanded, the groundwork was already finished, laid by families who understood that real power isn't something you see, it is something you supply. By the time the skyline started climbing, the smartest families had already pivoted from selling products to owning the dirt. Real estate wasn't sexy in the early days. It took patience, capital discipline, and an unshakable belief in the city's future. But if you understood land, you understood destiny. This was the era when a wealthy family stopped thinking like merchants and started thinking like architects of power. Owning property gave them something a business never could: immortality. Shops can go bust, factories can burn down, markets crash. The land stays. Quietly, strategically, families started scooping up small parcels across town, regular houses, corner lots, aging storefronts. No flash, no press releases, just pure accumulation. A wealthy family didn't need to build the tallest tower, they just needed to own the ground everyone else would eventually need. This strategy was like compound interest. As Toronto grew, transit lines moved, neighborhoods shifted, and suddenly those forgotten properties became gold mines. Rent checks kept clearing, values multiplied. The banks that used to reject them were now begging to partner up. The same families once locked out of the elite circles were now dictating the terms. Each wealthy family that mastered real estate gained leverage not just over money, but over the physical space of the city. The scary part was how invisible it was. There were no factories to picket, no storefronts to boycott. Ownership was silent. And while the public was watching the loud industrialists, these families were positioning themselves underneath the future financial districts. Control doesn't need to scream, it just waits. This land power changed the trajectory. It bankrolled the grandkids, bulletproofed the family fortune against downturns, and allowed influence to outlive the individual. A wealthy family that owned land owned time. And in a boomtown like Toronto, time was the most expensive asset on the market. We were way past survival mode now. This was strategy turning into total domination. With the land and the supply chain secured, the new fight was over labor. Factories were pumping, production was scaling, and thousands of workers were grinding in garment shops and metal yards. This is where ambition met pressure. A wealthy family couldn't rely on hustle alone anymore. They had to manage people, politics, and risk. Growth is great, but it brings conflict, and Toronto was about to feel the heat. As demand surged, conditions got tight. Long hours, razor-thin margins, and relentless deadlines defined the industrial grind. Owners were stuck between satisfying powerful buyers and keeping the lights on. For a wealthy family, this was the first real test of leadership under fire. Labor disputes flared up, unions organized, and entire neighborhoods watched as strikes shut down production lines. This wasn't just about a paycheck. It was a brawl over dignity, power, and who really held the keys to the city's economic engine. What people often forget is how personal these battles were. The bosses and the workers, they shared a language, a culture, sometimes even bloodlines. Negotiations went down at kitchen tables and synagogue halls. A wealthy family stood at the center of impossible choices: protect the profit margin or preserve the community bond. Some crashed and burned. Others adapted, brought in professional management, and realized that to get big, you had to get organized. Resilience didn't just happen. It was forged in the fire. Factories tightened up operations. Union deals kept the production lines moving. And the families who made it through figured out the most critical rule: if you want to go the distance, you need balance. The top dogs weren't the ones who ruthlessly crushed their enemies, but the ones who could weather a hurricane without cracking their foundation. That era didn't just change the face of Toronto's workforce. It hardened the business elite like steel. Conflict bred discipline. High pressure sharpened their game plans. Out of that intense heat, the city's real money didn't just survive, it leveled up, moving forward smarter, stronger, and prepped for the next big jump. Once the cash flow steadied, the mindset within these dynasties shifted. Having a massive bank account wasn't the endgame anymore. Real influence needs to live longer than quarterly profits. That's when giving back became part of the playbook, not just as charity, but as a tactical move. These families realized that money might kick the door open, but institutions keep it unlocked for your grandkids. We're talking hospitals, libraries, universities, community hubs. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were down payments on respectability. By bankrolling education and healthcare, a wealthy family wove itself into the city's moral DNA. Their names migrated from corporate filings to bronze plaques and building facades. What used to happen in the shadows was now out in the open and quietly respected. This move also served as armor for their fortunes. Institutions built networks. Networks forged alliances. Those connections cushioned the blow when the economy tanked and acted like a megaphone when things were booming. A family that gave back smartly bought something way pricier than goodwill. They bought permanence. Their capital wasn't just financial anymore, it was social currency. At the same time, philanthropy completely rebranded them. They weren't looked at as just factory bosses or landlords anymore. Now, they were patrons, civic builders, the guardians of the future. Their origin stories got rewritten less about hoarding cash and more about contributing to the greater good. This wasn't just PR spin. It was long-term chess. By tying their net worth to the city's health, they made sure their legacy could survive market crashes, political flip-flops, and the passing of the torch. When power digs its roots deep enough, it stops looking like power. It just becomes part of the landscape. The clock is the ultimate judge of influence. As the founders got old and stepped aside, their empires hit the danger zone, the handoff. History proves inheriting cash is simple, but inheriting grit is a different story. More dynasties crumble in the second generation than in any stock market collapse. If a family didn't prep the kids, they'd watch decades of sacrifice evaporate in silence. The survivors treated succession planning like a military operation. The kids weren't just sent to Ivy League schools, they were schooled on the factory floor. They mastered the daily grind, the risks, and the discipline before they ever tasted the perks. In these houses, your reputation meant more than your comfort. They knew entitlement was the express lane to ruin. When the next generation took the wheel, the strategy shifted. The founders played offense, the heirs played defense and expansion. They took profits from bricks and mortar and spread them into banking, infrastructure, and tech. It wasn't greed, it was insulation. Relying on one sector made you a target. Diversifying made you bulletproof. Keeping your mouth shut became a tactic, too. Being loud puts a target on your back. The smartest families faded into the background, letting the corporate brands shine, while ownership stayed buried in layers of anonymity. Influence migrated from the shop floor to the boardroom, from the sidewalk to the senator's office. The power got quieter, but the roots went deeper. By this point, they weren't reacting to the news. They were ahead of it. New zoning laws, transit lines, demographic shifts, none of it was a surprise. A family that mastered the art of foresight stopped chasing quick bucks and started positioning themselves for sure things. That is how a legacy stays alive, not by being the loudest in the room, but through control, patience, and doing your homework. By the late 1900s, Toronto crossed a major line. It wasn't just a boomtown anymore, it was a global contender. Money moved at light speed, borders blurred, and size was everything. This was the crossroads. Stay a big fish in a small pond, or step onto the world stage and gamble it all. The ones who expanded knew globalization favored the prepared. Real estate assets unlocked loans from overseas. Manufacturing know-how worked in any language. What began in tight-knit immigrant blocks now reached major financial hubs. They stopped thinking in terms of city streets and started thinking in currencies, time zones, and decades. But going global required discipline. One wrong move on that scale magnifies your mistakes. Debt is a seductive trap. Some clans confused a hot streak with being untouchable and paid the ultimate price. Others played it cool, growing through quiet partnerships instead of flashy buyouts. Respect the economic weather patterns and you survive. Ignore them and you vanish. The difference boiled down to memory. The families who remembered what it was like to be broke never stopped being cautious. They treated every boom like a bubble waiting to burst and every recession as a guarantee. That mindset, forged under pressure, was their secret weapon. If you kept your discipline, you could weather storms that sank everyone else. At this stage, these dynasties weren't just shaping Toronto, they were wired into the global economy. Yet, the playbook stayed the same. Patience beats ego, structure beats hype, and control beats speed. Their power had gone international, but the roots stayed planted right at home. Every empire eventually hits a wall. Markets turn, cycles shift, and bulletproof strategies suddenly develop cracks. This is the chapter nobody likes to talk about, the moment when even the elite have to face losses, shrinking margins, and the fact that nothing lasts forever. It's not about how you make the money, it's about how you act when the heat gets turned up. Recessions expose the weak spots. Expansions fueled by cheap debt imploded. A little too much swagger erased 50 years of discipline in a single season. Some dynasties were wiped out overnight, becoming nothing more than footnotes. Others pivoted fast, dumping assets, restructuring deals, and pulling back. The survivors knew a harsh truth. A strategic retreat isn't failure if it saves the kingdom. Crises also revealed who had real values. The families with layered defenses, diversified portfolios, low debt, strict rules absorbed the blow. They saw downturns as a reset button, not the end of the world. By respecting the risks, they accepted short-term hits to protect their long-term grip on power. That's when reputation really counted. Trust banked over generations became actual currency. Bankers cut them slack. Partners didn't bail. Institutions remembered who wrote the checks. When the chips were down, your history either saved you or buried you. The families who invested in credibility found open doors while everyone else got the cold shoulder. This phase separated the real deals from the imposters. It showed which empires were built on solid ground and which were running on fumes. The ones who made it through came out leaner, quieter, and way more deliberate, ready to survive the next 100 years, not just the next news cycle. Power doesn't just vanish during a crisis, it concentrates. In the end, you don't measure an empire by its size, but by the wisdom it leaves in its wake. After all the booms, busts, and rebuilds, these dynasties realized something profound. Cash is temporary, but values can last forever. The families that spanned generations redefined winning not as stacking up money, but as staying in the game. The biggest takeaway is restraint. Every story boils down to this. Speed gets you attention, but patience builds a legacy. The survivors knew their limits, respected the economic seasons, and never confused having power with keeping it. They invested in people just as much as real estate. Money gave them leverage, but trust gave them a shield. There is a deeper human lesson here, too. Many of these clans started from trauma, refugees, outcasts, people who lost everything. Instead of turning inward, they built outward. They created jobs, neighborhoods, and schools. At their best, these families didn't just drain value from the city, they strengthened the foundation. Success wasn't isolated, it was shared. For anyone watching today, the message is simple but hard to execute. Think long-term in a world obsessed with right now. Build your structure before you scale up. Choose reputation over reach. Pick control over comfort. A dynasty that lasts doesn't chase the noise. It pours the concrete that others will stand on long after the names are forgotten. Toronto's skyline tells one version of the story. Its history tells another. And that legacy doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room, it belongs to the most disciplined. If this deep dive into hidden power and elite dynasties gave you a fresh perspective, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment with the number 1 if you want more stories about global wealthy families. Type the number 2 if there's a specific city or dynasty you want us to investigate next. Your feedback drives where we go from here.